Okay, so my name is Zosia Beckles. I'm a research information analyst at the University of Bristol. And what I'm going to talk to you about is ethical data management and how we can balance the individual right to privacy with the public benefit that comes with sharing data. Can I advance my slides? This is the question. There we go. Right, so just as a kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about, firstly, kind of the big picture, what are the risks and rewards that can come with data sharing, what can happen if things go wrong, a quick look at the regulatory framework that we'll be operating in. I won't go into too much detail because I understand that the next talk is going to cover that in much more in depth. Then I'll talk about the different ways that we can manage that risk to participants. Finally, a look at some guidelines and tools for best practice that are available, and then sort of wrap up summary of the key takeaway points. Okay, so firstly, why do we want to share data at all? So this is all about maximising the value of research data. So it's a very valuable resource. It's taken time and effort to collect that data. It's also not just time and effort from researchers, but also from research participants as well. So it's about maximising the value of their input too, and reducing the burden on them to continue participating in new studies by reusing what's already out there. Improving the scientific record by making sure that we are keeping track of not only sort of the methods and results that come out of studies, but also the data itself that underpins those results. And also, as I'm sure you're aware, there's something of a replication crisis in science. So by data sharing, we can allow other researchers to verify and to replicate those findings. So again, it's kind of all about, as I said, maximising the value and reuse of research data. But what are the risks? These are all around, at least from the context I'm coming at it, it's all about participant privacy. The issue is that if we release a data set, there's going to be information in there that, well, there could be information in the data set itself that could be used to identify participants. That could be direct identifiers, so names, addresses, email addresses, that sort of thing. But there could also be combinations of indirect identifiers, so age, gender, general geographic location, employment history, and so on, which taken together could be enough to identify an individual. But even if you're careful about what's in the data set itself, there's still the issue of data linkage. So this is creating links between data sets. So for example, there was a good example a few years ago where Netflix released an anonymised data set of of what subscribers had watched, so times, dates and what they'd watched linked to a supposedly anonymised identifier. The problem was that at the same time, also available publicly was the IMDb data set of people's reviews and ratings for movies and TV shows. And so by linking those two data sets, people were able to match the times at which reviews and ratings have been posted in IMDb with the times something had been watched in Netflix, and they were able to identify people in the supposedly anonymised Netflix database. So you can see that between two ostensibly separate data sets, there's potential for identifying people. And even if there aren't two separate data sets, there could just generally be other information in the wider data environment that could be used to identify participants. So, for example, if a data set is published and the data set itself doesn't include information on where participants live, the protocol or the manuscript that reports the findings might include information on where the participants were recruited from. And so with that information, you then have another piece to add to the puzzle of what's in the data set, and again, it could potentially increase the risk to the participants. Right, so that's kind of an overview of the risks and the potential benefits to data sharing. What can happen when things go wrong? So essentially the kind of worst case scenario we're looking at is a data breach, disclosure of information that leads to the identification of a specific participant who was involved in a research study. And that obviously leads to potential harm to the participant, could lead to significant fines for the body that releases that information. I mean, also this kind of reputational damage and potentially future participants not wishing to get involved in research in the future. So those kind of issues. On a slightly smaller scale, there can be issues around not being able to publish data when you want to, because consent or whatever issues haven't been addressed beforehand. We can also find that if data can't be published, that can lead to issues with publishing the manuscript. So, for example, PLOS, BMJ, Open Science, the Nature research journals, these titles all require supporting data to be made available as a condition of publication. So if researchers haven't thought about how to meet that requirement, they can run into real problems when it comes to publishing manuscripts. And then finally, and this is something I'll talk a bit more about later, but freedom of information challenges. Research data that comes from publicly funded research is subject to FoIA challenges. That's just a matter of course, and it doesn't necessarily mean that any mistakes have been made in the data release process. That it can just be a function of the fact that it's publicly funded research. But it's important to note that FoIA challenges are much less likely to occur if there is a proper controlled data release process that that users can go through. FOI challenges should really be the last resort for getting hold of the data and not the only. Okay, so I talked a bit about the FOIA. So to kind of take a step back and look at the wider regulatory framework, there are three key pieces of legislation that affect how research data is managed and accessed. So firstly, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. Secondly, the 2018 Data Protection Act. And finally, the 2000 Freedom of Information Act. And I'll talk a little bit about these in the next couple of slides. As I said, my colleague's going to cover them in more depth later, but just to kind of give you the headlines. So firstly, GDPR and the Data Protection Act. What these do is to define expectations and responsibilities around participants' personal data, including special category data, which is personal data that's sort of so sensitive that extra care has to be taken. These pieces of legislation also set out exemptions for research, so ways in which the rules can be relaxed slightly for if you're handling data for research purposes. But I think the key thing that these pieces of legislation have really done is to clarify what the requirements are for keeping research participants properly informed of the use and reuse of their data. It's not really anything new. This requirement still existed under the previous incarnation of the Data Protection Act, but I think it's set out much more clearly in the new legislation in terms of the things that participants have to be informed of, how they have to be informed is much clearer in this current incarnation. One thing I do want to mention at this point is that anonymised data is not subject to GDPR. So when it comes to research data, if what you're working with is anonymised, then these particular pieces of legislation don't apply. So you don't have to worry about those restrictions. Okay, so the third piece of legislation that is relevant here is the Freedom of Information Act. So this is the piece of legislation that allows the general public to request access to publicly funded research data. I mean, it's much broader than that, but in this particular context, that's what's relevant here. And the key thing to note is that the Information Commissioner's Office has in the past ruled that data should be released where the risks to individuals are perceived to be low. So, for example, the decision notice that I've linked to there is a case where Queen Mary University of London faced a request from a patient advocacy group for some data related to the PACE trial, which was about graded exercise therapy in chronic fatigue syndrome, that's it. And the issue was that Queen Mary University declined the request on a number of grounds, one of which was the perceived disclosure risk to the participants. When it came to the Information Commissioner's Office, they ruled that the data should actually be released because they felt the disclosure risk was low. This went to appeal, and that decision was upheld on appeal, and the data was in fact released. So there is an understanding that via FOI, this kind of data can be released, which is not to say that you shouldn't go through the route of having a proper controlled data release process. That's a much safer way to release this sort of data, but just to be aware that FOI is another route to access that data, and it's not going to be the case that all data would be released via this route. It often can only be a subset of data once it's been sufficiently anonymised, but yeah, just to kind of be aware that this is another route that individuals can take to access that data. Okay, so how do we go about managing the risk to participants so that we can make data available in a safe way? So first, the kind of first and foremost thing I think that's most important is informed consent. So this is making sure that your research participants are informed of any plans that you have for data sharing. So what data is going to be shared, what elements of it, how it's going to be made available, and who will have access to it. The other thing to note here is that ethical consent, informed consent to participate in a study is not the same as consent as a GDPR legal basis for data processing. These can be bundled together in one consent form, but you don't have to use consent as the basis for data processing. You could use public task, say, in a research context. So it's important that you are clear in your consent forms and your patient information sheets. What's the legal basis for data processing, and also what you are, whether you're seeking consent to share data or whether you are seeking consent for people to participate in a study, and a condition of that consent is their understanding that their data will be shared. They're two slightly different ways to approach the same issue. So just kind of be aware of that. As an example of ways in which consent can be a bit confused, here are two examples of clauses from the same consent form. No, names have been redacted to protect the guilty. These are from the same consent form. So in the first clause, you see data will be kept confidential. And in the second clause, data may be used by other researchers. Now, coming at it from a sort of data management expertise perspective, it seems fairly evident that what's meant by the first clause is they're referring to administrative data, names, contact details, that kind of thing. And the second clause is referring to possibly anonymised research data, the results of the study. But it's not clear, and it's particularly unclear whether or not a research participant not coming from that kind of background would understand what was meant and what they were agreeing to by taking part in this study. So that's kind of what I mean about making sure that your participants are fully informed and you're being very clear to them exactly what's going to happen with each element of their data and at each stage of the research life cycle. Okay, so the other way to manage risk in terms of risk to participants is through data minimisation. So this is the idea of limiting the data that you collect, the amount of identifiable information you collect, and anonymising it as early as possible in order to just reduce the amount of potentially disclosive information you hold. If you don't hold it, then it can't be disclosed. So this is things like thinking about the minimum variables needed and the level of precision needed. So for example, do you need, if you need age, which is quite common, do you need individual ages or would age bands do? If you need date of birth, do you need the full date of birth, day, month, year, or would just month and year do, or just year? This sort of thing. In terms of anonymising as early as possible, this could be, for example, if you're collecting interview data, can you use a pseudonym at the point of interview so that you never actually record the person's real name, that sort of thing. The idea is just to minimise the amount of potentially disclosive information you hold so that the risk is inherently lower. Okay, so the third way of managing risk to participants is through anonymisation. So this could be data alteration techniques such as formal and statistical anonymisation, which are basically either removing or masking elements of the data to make it either to remove identifiers entirely or to make it more difficult to find combinations of indirect identifiers that could identify a participant. Yeah, so those are kind of the two data alteration techniques. The other form of anonymisation is called functional anonymisation. This is all about managing the wider data environment. So this is things like controlling the way you release data by getting participants to sign data access agreements, which limit what they can and can't do with the data, which control how much they can link it with other data sets, that sort of thing. Or perhaps releasing data via a data haven. This would be a controlled environment where people can go and analyse the data and take away just sort of summary statistics. So the data itself never leaves the place where it's held. And that is a much more controlled way of handling data sharing. The thing to note is that in this context, GDPR and the Data Protection Act would likely still apply because the data itself isn't fully anonymised, otherwise it could have been released more openly. So you do need to still be aware of those requirements. Okay, so in terms of best practice guidelines, there are quite a few places to go for support and guidance on these issues. I've just highlighted a couple that I think are the sort of most valuable. So firstly, in Information Commissioner's Office, there are some really useful kind of quite plain English guides to GDPR and the Data Protection Act, and also a lot of sort of checklists for what should go into privacy notices and that kind of thing. The NHS Health Research Authority also has some excellent templates for privacy notices and consent forms. And finally, the ICPSR has really good recommended language for consent forms to make sure that you are clearly conveying what you plan to do in terms of data sharing. In terms of anonymisation guidance, I recommend the UK Anonymisation Network. They've got an excellent handbook on, they call it the UK Anonymisation Framework, which goes through a lot of techniques for anonymisation and how they can be applied. The UK Data Service has some excellent guides on that as well. And the last thing I've linked to here is a really nice website demo it's linked to a study 2019 by Rocha, which basically looks at a sample of census microdata and tries to ascertain how many different attributes would be required to identify participants. And it's quite disturbing. I think they've figured out that sort of only 15 attributes were needed to identify 99% of participants in this survey. So, and what the website allows you to do is kind of choose which particular attributes you use and see how that affects the disclosure risk. And it's quite eye-opening. I definitely recommend having a play with that. Okay, so that was guidelines. In terms of anonymisation tools, I would highly recommend QA My Data and the R package SDC Micro. SDC Micro is more aimed at numerical data, but along with the other two packages, Argus and ARX below, what it will allow you to do is to load in some data, look at the overall disclosure risk, apply some anonymisation techniques and see how that changes the disclosure risk. I've only really used SDC Micro, but they all kind of operate in the same way. QA My Data, also from the UK Data Service, is again really useful bit of kit that will, it's wider than just anonymisation, but one of the things it does is you can get it to look for particular strings, so number strings that match telephone numbers or credit card numbers or email addresses or that kind of thing to look for direct identifiers. But it will also check for things like whether variables have labels, whether there's any missing data, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of broader QA as well as anonymisation things. Yeah, so those are just some tools that I found really useful in doing these sorts of checks on data before going for release. Okay, so just to kind of sum up what the key takeaway things are from that I'd like you to get from this would be, firstly, plan early. So think about what you're going to share, how you're going to share it, and who you're going to share it with, so that you can then inform your participants of this, so that they know exactly what they're agreeing to when it comes to participating. Thirdly, minimise the data that's being collected as far as possible, because if you don't have it, then it can't be released. Then, you know, if minimize the risk by minimizing the amount of data, essentially. And lastly, just as a kind of general good practice thing, these things take time. Anonymizing data takes time, and potentially money as well, if you need to buy specialist software to blur out faces and that sort of thing. So make sure that you are factoring in those costs in terms of time and resource into the sort of overall research plan, so that you've got time to make sure that your data can be released at the end of the study. Okay, that is it from me.